This world that we all call home is a planet in upheaval. Across the US and around the world, everywhere we look, there is turmoil and chaos. Some is nature going to the extreme, and some is man-made. All of it leaving a wake of ashes and dust. National and world leaders have little to no answers and actually spend more time blaming each other than they do trying to find adequate answers to the problems we face. But there are answers. Answers that will not be found by human devising, but rather are contained upon the pages of the Bible. Join us as In the Scriptures, in association with the ministry Voice of Prophecy, presents Discovering Revelation, coming to you from Murphy, North Carolina. And now, here's your host, Pastor Craig Fish.
Is there meaning or direction to our existence? Is there really a God? Or is the world just some kind of accident? Are we intentionally made, or we just here by chance? Now, there are many answers that people will give to a question like that, but we're going to actually take some time to see what it is that the Bible has to say. We're going to presume that the Bible is something that is going to give us the answers as we move. Life doesn't always go the way that we think that it should. Life will sometimes throw us curveballs. And we have to ask these things. Is there really rhythm and rhyme to the whole cycle of how life goes? People who will be right in the midst of what they call the prime of their life, they're making their plans, and then an accident happens and those plans are completely wiped away. Perhaps they lose their life. Perhaps they lose a loved one. Perhaps their dreams are dashed to pieces and everything that they've worked so hard for never comes to be. Is this really how God intended for things to be? Well, as we ask questions like this, as we ask questions of, is there really a God? Does it really matter? Are we here by happenstance, or is there purpose to all of this? We're going to look for some answers in some very unusual places this evening. Now, some of you may recognize these two individuals. On your right, the individual you will see, you'll probably recognize more so than the one on your left. The person on your left, his name was the Duke of Wellington. The person on your right is Napoleon Bonaparte. These were two individuals that were mortal enemies with each other. But yet at the same time, these two men had a great deal in common. Both of them were born in the year 1769. They were both born on an island. Both of them lost their father at a very early age. They both had 3 sisters and 4 brothers. Aside from that, both of them went to the same military school in France at the same time. Both of them became lieutenant colonels within a day of each other. These were two individuals who knew each other quite well. But yet, things turned out very differently for them. Now, as we look at some of their histories, we know that they were both also very excellent in math, and they were both very good at commanding very large armies, which is what put them in the positions that they were in. Above that, though, there has to be this question. When the Duke of Wellington and Napoleon met in battle at Waterloo, why, if these two individuals are so evenly matched, did the Duke of Wellington come out on top and Napoleon failed? Well, historians will give various answers as for why they believe this to be so. Some will say that it was the geography of the battle that favored the Duke of Wellington. Others might say that it was the Prussian army, that when they joined up with Wellington, that this was too much for Napoleon to overcome. I mean, after all, Napoleon had suffered some defeats. His excursion into Russia in 1812 was a disaster. In 1813, the Sixth Coalition pummeled him, and then there was an invasion of France. Then he went into exile at Elba, and Napoleon was by no means the man that he used to be at this point in time. But is that really the reason? Some would also say that Napoleon was just simply tired from all of this, that he was worn out, and that he had given all his best only to come to nothing. Are these really the reasons why Napoleon lost at Waterloo? Well, this is something else that we're also going to ask about, and we're going to find the answer in a very different place. In fact, we're going to back the clock up from the point of Waterloo and the point of the Duke of Wellington and Napoleon Bonaparte's life. We're going to turn the clock back some more than 2,000 years before this, actually close to 2,400 years before. And we're going to enter into the bedroom of a king who is having a disturbing dream. This king's name is Nebuchadnezzar. This is the man who is responsible for building the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This is a kingdom that his father had passed on to him, but then Nebuchadnezzar is the one who built it up into the empire that it would become. The famed empire, possibly the wealthiest empire to ever grace the face of the earth. Well, one night, Nebuchadnezzar, you can imagine this king in all of his luxury and glory, probably having this great, soft, comfortable bed to sleep upon. You'd think that he would have the best night's rest. He would have the best of everything at his disposal. But yet he has this dream that rouses him from his sleep. It disturbs him so much that we might think of it as a dream, but he might actually have thought of it more of a nightmare. And it woke him in the middle of the night, so much so that he was disturbed and called for help. This is what the Bible has to say regarding this. This is from Daniel chapter 2, verse 1. Now, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled, that his sleep left him. Now, this is a man that was scared of nothing. Nebuchadnezzar was a man that was not afraid to take risks. He was not afraid of danger. This is why he was able to build the Babylonian Empire into what it was. But this dream most certainly scared him. And so what does he do? But in the middle of the night, he calls for the Chaldeans, the magicians, the magi, if you will. These were the people who were the philosophers of the day, the scientists, the astronomers, the mathematicians, the priests of the empire. Everybody who was of the educated elite were kind of in this category. It's interesting how it is that Nebuchadnezzar, even his name means, may the God of education protect him. That's what the name Nebuchadnezzar means. Protect him, the king. So education and science were things that were considered of extreme importance in the Babylonian Empire. But science only goes so far, because ultimately science is left up to us to interpret the data that we see. You could take 3 of the most educated people that there are, stick them in the room to all look at the same set of data, and come up with 3 very different interpretations of that data. So when we make science the God that we bow down to, who are we truly bowing down to but ourselves, as we make ourselves the final determiner of what is true as we look at that scientific data? Now, this is not to say that science is a bad thing. Of course it's a good thing. It's what has led to scientific research in many different areas. But we also have to be careful about how we interpret the data that we receive. But on top of these individuals, these are also the religious leaders of their time. These are the people that Nebuchadnezzar calls into his throne room. And he says something very odd to them. They come in. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. That was the common language of that place and time. O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dreams, and we will manufacture, we will give you the interpretation. See, one of the things we have to understand about the ancient Babylonian Empire, and really any ancient empire for that matter, is dreams were an extremely important thing. This was something that was very commonly thought, that if you live in a society where there are many gods that are worshipped, that dreams were one of those areas that they thought this is how the gods communicated with the people, is through their dreams. And so when Nebuchadnezzar is having this dream, he is convinced that the gods are speaking to him, and he really wants to know what the message of this dream is. But on top of that, that also means that these educated elite are also very well trained in looking at dreams, picking up the symbols, and they had various interpretations as far as what things could mean. So what exactly does this spell out for these Chaldeans? He gets this idea that, wait a minute, as he tells them, I've had this dream and I want to know the interpretation, these individuals come before him and they're thinking, that's it? This is why you've so urgently called us beforehand. Well, that's going to be easy. You just tell us the details of the dream. We'll go look at our books, and we will tell you what the dream means. But Nebuchadnezzar isn't so convinced. He kind of smells a rat in all of this, if you will. And he says, no, this isn't quite how it's going to work out. See, it's okay if you're an empire, if you're an emperor who's ruling an empire and you do so with good counsel. But when you're being given bad counsel, that usually doesn't end up going so well for very long. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, "My decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces. Your houses shall be made an ash heap." In other words, he's going to burn down their homes. "However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, look what happens. You shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretations." Well, you can just imagine for just a moment that these Chaldeans who come before the king, when they hear that he has this dream and he's looking for the interpretation, they may have wiped the sweat off their brow. Whew, is that all you're looking for? But now, all of a sudden, the game has changed incredibly. Now they have to tell the king what it is that he has dreamed, and then give the interpretation of the dream as well. Now, this is something that they're going to admit in just a moment is impossible for them to do. In fact, let's take a look at the very next verse. This is Daniel chapter 2, starting in verse 7. "They answered again and said, 'Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation.' The king answered and said to them, 'I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give it the interpretation.'" He's basically saying, I know you guys are stalling for time. Now, have you ever had a dream, something that maybe even woke you out of your sleep, and maybe the details, it doesn't take long for the details to start to fade from your memory? Well, this is something Nebuchadnezzar is having, only this is something very deliberate, as we're going to see in a moment, very deliberately that God is making to fade from Nebuchadnezzar's memory, because there's something very particular that's about to happen in this whole occurrence. And we're going to see exactly what that is. But you can get the sense that the Chaldeans, that sweat that they wiped off their brow a minute ago, is starting to come back tenfold from what it was. The Chaldeans admit, what you are asking, king, nobody can do. Only the gods can read people's minds, and they don't live here. Their dwelling is not with flesh. That's probably the first true statement that they've made in a very long time. What does the Bible have to say on this? 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 39 says, "For you," that's speaking of God, "you alone know the hearts of all the sons of men." These guys were stuck in a predicament, and they weren't getting out of it anytime soon. What is it that they say? It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods whose dwelling is not with flesh. So again, now they're stating, we don't know the answer. We cannot do what you are asking us to do. Well, this does not go well for these men. In fact, it infuriates the king so much that he sends for all the wise men to be killed. What does it say here? Daniel 2:12. "For this reason the king was angry and very furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon." Now, something that we have to understand is that when Nebuchadnezzar called these men in before him, it was basically the best of the best that came in before him to serve in this capacity that he's asking for. Not all the wise men in the kingdom were brought before him. Only the top, only the great elite were. But this command was made to kill all the wise men of the kingdom, which means they had to go out and round up the rest. Well, this is where somebody else gets brought into the story. This is a young man by the name of Daniel. Daniel was not a Babylonian. In fact, if we read in the previous chapter, Daniel chapter 1, we see that Daniel is a Jewish young man who has been taken into Babylonian captivity. He and several of his friends have been put into a special program and made to serve as counselors in the king's court as a result of their of how they have excelled in this special program. They learned the language of the Chaldeans. They learned the science of the Chaldeans, the ways of how the empire works, and they have proven themselves to be above and beyond everybody else that they were trained with. So they were put into this group. Now, they're getting caught up in this fray. These other guys have failed to do what the king is asking, but they're getting caught up in it as well. So the captain of the guard finds Daniel, knocks on the door, says, "We got to go. All the wise men have to be killed." And then Daniel is like, "Why is the king's command so urgent?" So the captain of the guard tells him what it is that's happening. And what is it that Daniel does? Daniel takes the moment to go in before the king, and this is what we see. So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time that he might tell the interpretation to the king. Daniel makes a very respectful request for more time, and then goes and does what all of us need to do when our backs are also up against the wall. But you know what? We have to think about this. We should not limit this to when our backs are up against the wall. This should be how we start every day, how we end every day, and how we take time throughout the course of every day to truly tune ourselves in to the ear of God. And that is that Daniel and his companions prayed. They had a very instantaneous prayer meeting asking for God to give them guidance and direction for what it is that the king was asking for, because they knew that the wise men were not going to be able to do this. But you know what? Here's the wonderful thing. Daniel serves a God. He served a God that answers prayer. And after they take their time, we don't know how long they took, but Daniel comes back in before the king. And this is what we see. Daniel 2, verses 27 and 28. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king." Now, a soothsayer is a term you might not be recognizing. That's actually an ancient term for what we think of as a psychic. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets. Now, sometimes there are those who ask the question, is there a God? Well, Daniel just gave us the answer to that question. Not only did Daniel say that there is a God in heaven, but he also says something else about what qualifies this God who reveals secrets. This is Daniel continuing to speak, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you. And its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. So now, before we go any further, let's make sure we take a moment to review this. The head was made of gold. The chest and the arms were made of silver. The belly and the thighs were made of bronze. The legs of iron, and the feet were a mixture of iron and clay. But the dream does not end here, for what is it that Daniel says next? You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together. Now notice how suddenly the order has reversed. It goes backwards from iron back to gold. But they were crushed together and became as chaff on the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away, so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now you can imagine, as Daniel has just spoken these things to the king, you can imagine just leaning forward, maybe even scooting forward a little bit into his chair. The room has fallen silent, provided there's anybody else in there. Daniel has just done what the king was just told could not be done, at least by any living human. But Daniel did exactly that. So now, what does this mean? I can just imagine Nebuchadnezzar saying, Daniel, that is it. That's exactly what I dreamed. As he's hearing these details, perhaps the imagery is coming back to his mind. Yes, that's it. That's what I dreamed. So Daniel takes the time to explain these things to the dream, but then he gives him an inspired interpretation. This is one of the few chapters of the Bible where we see not only a vision, a prophecy that's given, but we also receive the interpretation of that vision in the very same chapter. We see it's being handed out, and we see its practical application as well. So let's see what it is that Daniel has to say regarding this. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven, he has given them into your hands and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. Now Daniel spells it out quite clearly. There is absolutely no guesswork here as for what it is that Daniel is talking about. He isn't having some nebulous kind of speech here. See, one of the things that the Chaldeans would do when it came to interpreting his dreams is they would come up with things and say them in a vague enough way that they could point at any one of a dozen different things as saying, oh, that's the fulfillment of what your dream was. But Daniel isn't leaving room. He isn't making this vague. He is being very clear. You, Nebuchadnezzar, you are this head of gold. You are this king who has made Babylon this mighty empire. Babylon was the reigning world superpower, if you will, from about the year 605 BC to the year 539 BC. It ruled uncontested. Now, an interesting thing about the kingdom of Babylon is that when you actually look at it in comparison to the size of other kingdoms, Babylon was not all that large. The Roman Empire was bigger. The Medo-Persian Grecian Empire was larger. They were all bigger. But Babylon, because of where it was located, that's what made it such a powerful and influential kingdom. It was a crossroads of travel between the east and the west. Just think, what is it? Babylon sat in modern-day Iraq. The ruins of the city are still there to this day. And what is it that when we think of the Middle East, what is the primary export that comes out of there but oil? Well, that wasn't something new. They had tar pits and oil all over the place. This was probably something that they could export at great cost, and I'm sure it was something that helped to make the financial stability of the empire quite well. We actually even see that this may possibly have become something that we see used later in the book of Daniel within the story of the fiery furnace. How is it that they heated that fire up so much hotter? Could it be that they were using oil? However, Babylon would not last forever. Nebuchadnezzar has passed away. His son, his grandson, sit on the throne. And then, this is in the year 539, and somebody else comes marching along. But before then, Babylon was a mighty and powerful and influential empire. It was decorated with gold statues all over the place. There was gold that hemmed buildings and walls all throughout the city. In fact, the city of Babylon and the Babylonian Empire were of such tremendous influence 2,600 years ago that there are still things to this day that we use that are Babylonian in nature. For example, have you ever heard of a horoscope? Have you ever heard of astrology? These things all come from Babylonians. From all that time, 2,600 years ago, and they're still in use today. But Babylon would not last forever. Notice what it is here that Daniel then says to Nebuchadnezzar. But after you shall arise another kingdom inferior to yours. Well, what would this be? Daniel is being very clear. Babylon will not last forever. Somebody else is going to come and conquer the kingdom. Well, what would that be? Of course, after the head of gold comes the chest and arms of silver. Well, who would that be? It turns out that the kingdom of Babylon was defeated by the Medo-Persian coalition. This happened in the year 539 BC. Now, how did this happen? The city of Babylon was a grand city. But in the year 539, the Babylonian city of Babylon was sieged by the Medo-Persian army. Now, when the Medo-Persians arrived, Cyrus, their commanding general, knew that the city of Babylon was going to be almost impossible to defeat. The city of Babylon was a grand structure. It had 3 sets of walls. All of them were thick and high. The outside wall alone was too much to get over, let alone that if you could get through that, then there'd be a second wall behind it, and then a third wall behind that. It was almost impossible for them to defeat the city of Babylon. They had an almost endless water supply because the Euphrates River flowed right under the city, right through it, under the wall. There was even a section of the city of Babylon that was kept for planting crops. They could grow their own crops right inside the city walls. There was nothing they could do. They had an endless food supply and an endless water supply. In fact, some stories tell us that when the Medo-Persians showed up, that the Babylonians would actually throw food over the walls to the Medo-Persians. The Medo-Persians had to have supplies brought to them. The Babylonians in their city had everything that they needed. And they were doing this to taunt the Persians. We have food to spare. Here you go, have some. We know you're going to need this in the long run. See, these sieges of cities were not something that only lasted for days or weeks, or in some cases only months. Sometimes they lasted a long time. For example, the Bible tells us that when Nebuchadnezzar went against the city of Jerusalem, he sieged it for 18 months. A year and a half it took for the Babylonians to make the city of Jerusalem crumble. But they did it. He was a king who wasn't going to back down. And you can imagine that they would have to plan for a siege of at least that long to camp outside the city of Babylon and to expect to make it fall. However, Cyrus, the commanding general of the Medo-Persian army, was a very intelligent man and very observant. And one of the things that he observed upon his approach to the city of Babylon was that there were different dikes and man-made dams along the Euphrates River that were meant to divert the river along and direct it toward the city of Babylon. So, in his very wise thinking, he ordered his men to start breaking down those dikes and those dams and to allow the river to flow back to where it naturally came from. Well, next thing you know, the riverbed dries up. Well, that very same night, the reigning king, the person who is sitting on the throne in Babylon, is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. His name is Belshazzar. He thinks that because this city is so impregnable, that they're going to throw a party instead of being worried. Well, in the meantime, the Euphrates River drives up under the walls of Babylon. The Medo-Persian army can walk right under the wall, right under on a practically dry riverbed, climb up the banks, and what do you know? As they come, there's these walls that line the sides of the rivers, but the gates are left wide open. And the Persians are able to go in, and incidentally, there's only one person that we are recorded in the Bible that died that night, and that was Belshazzar himself. But that night, the city of Babylon fell to the Medes and the Persians. But even then, this would not end the dream or the vision as well. For what is it that comes next? Daniel continues, then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. Well, who is this that this kingdom of bronze could possibly be? But what it is that follows the chest and arms of silver, but this belly and thighs of bronze. And this ends up being the Greeks. In the year 331, under Alexander the Great, there was conflict between the Grecian army and the Medo-Persian army. Alexander the Great came out on top. There was 3 major conflicts, and he won every single one of them. Some of them, he was tremendously outnumbered, but because Alexander the Great was of such military prowess and insight, he defeated the Persians with almost not breaking a sweat. And then Alexander the Great continued on. He got all the way as far as the coast of India. And when he got there, history tells us, or at least some accounts of it, tell us that Alexander the Great wept as he looked at the water, not because of the view or because it was so beautiful, but because there were no more worlds to conquer. This was a man who was driven for conquest. He had an empire of over 2 million square miles. He had over 20 million subjects under his control by the time he was done. And he did all this before his 32nd birthday. Alexander the Great, however, eventually turned back. And one night when he was back towards Babylon, he died. And some people believe that he drank himself to death. He was a heavy drinker. He could conquer everything but himself. But his kingdom outlasted him. And you will see that in the year 168, BC that is, there is another kingdom that arises. And what is it that Daniel has to say about this? Then a fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. So now who is it that comes after the Grecians and defeats them? We have seen the head of gold. They were beaten by the Persians, the chest and arms of silver, who were also then likewise beaten by the Grecians, the belly and the thighs of bronze. Well, who is it that then defeated the Grecian army? But in the year 168 BC, the Romans come on the scene, and they defeat the Grecians and become one of the uncontested world superpowers to last longer than all those other kingdoms did. And incidentally, there's one more point that I'd like for us to look at. And that is, when we think of Babylon, it was known as the Golden City, hence represented by a head of gold. When we think of the Medo-Persian Empire, they were the Medes and the Persians, two arms, and they were made of silver. The Medes and the Persians used silver as their currency. When we think of the belly and thighs of bronze, well, the Greeks used a ton of bronze in their helmets, their shields, their armors, their swords. They used bronze in quite a few things. And likewise, also, Rome used a lot of iron. They were known as the Iron Empire. And it's interesting how there are two legs. Eventually, Rome was split from a single empire into East and Western Rome. But what is it, and I'll come to that in just a moment, but what is it here that a famous historian, his name is Edward Gibbons, he wrote a series called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. It's probably one of the most decisive works on that topic. But what is it that Mr. Gibbons has to say regarding Rome? The images of gold, silver, and brass that might serve to represent the nations and their kings were successively broken by the iron monarchy of Rome. Now, friends, either Edward Gibbon was just looking at the imagery of these nations, or he understood Bible prophecy. And he saw how it is that these empires were represented by these metals. For a very long time, many Christians understood everything that I am talking about tonight and knew it clearly. However, today, there seems to be a lot of confusion about how these things can possibly be represented and what it is that they truly mean. I've actually met people who believe that the legs of iron were Egypt, but yet there's nothing in the history to show us that this is possible. But what else is it then that Daniel has to say? Continuing on, he says, "Whereas you saw the feet and toes partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided." Now, something we have to understand. Babylon was defeated by the Medes and the Persians. The Medes and the Persians were defeated by the Greeks. The Greeks were defeated by the Romans, but the Romans were never ultimately defeated as an empire by anybody else. Rome essentially fell apart. It defeated itself. And many of the same things that made the Roman Empire crumble are many of the same things that we face as a nation right now. But this kingdom would be divided, and that is exactly what we see happen. Rome was divided. First, it was divided into East and West. And of course, the Eastern Roman Empire lasted far longer than the Western Roman Empire. And what is it that happened to the Western Roman Empire? And as the toes and the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly weak. This is not only what we see in history, but it's what we even see to this very day. Some of the nations that came out of the crumbling of the Western Roman Empire, some of them are strong, some of them are weak. And here we have what happened to the Western Roman Empire. It was divided. We see here in this graph that purple part up there where it says the Anglo-Saxons. That's Britain as we know it. Where it says the Franks. that became France. The Visigoths became the Spanish. The Suevi became the Portuguese. The Hurrieli became the Italians, and so on and so forth. These were the nations that arose out of the crumbling of the Western Roman Empire. And there were more that would come later on as a result of further development. But this is not where the story ends. What else do we see here? As you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men. But pay close attention to this very next verse, this very next statement right here. But they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. So what could that possibly mean? The Western Roman Empire had crumbled. There were all these tribes that basically whittled out sections for themselves, and they ended up becoming nations of themselves. And they were always kind of bickering with one another, fighting back and forth over territory, over resources. And this was something that was very dangerous for everybody. Nobody had peace. But eventually, individuals start coming along that try to take those nations and weld them back together into a unified nation, or at least a unified body of nations. One such individual was Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria was once known as the grandmother of Europe. Now, how is that possible? Well, it was a very common practice in royal families to marry off children or grandchildren into other royal families of other nations. This was meant to create a coalition of peace between these nations. Well, Queen Victoria was somebody who had so many children and so many grandchildren, they were married off into all the other royal families throughout Europe, that they all were her grandchildren. Hence, she was known as the grandmother of Europe. But of course, this was something that did not last. It ended up falling apart just like it always has before. In fact, the century after Victoria was a bloodier century than any of the previous centuries combined. Now, in fact, let's take another look at somebody else. Here we have Charlemagne, which is French for Charles the Great. Charlemagne was somebody who was king of the Franks. Remember the Franks, they became the French. He started ruling in the year 768 AD. Then he became king of Italy in 774 as well. He became one of the first individuals to actually become an established emperor in Europe. 300 years after the collapse of Rome. He was called the father of Europe, not because he was fathering so many children, but because he was trying to weld it all back together. But let me ask you, did he bring that lasting peace? Well, no, he didn't. He may have tried to, but he ultimately failed. And what do we have is that he may have been a talented soldier, but ultimately his plan to bring these nations back together failed. His last work was to take his empire and pass it on to his two oldest sons, but they both died before he did. So what he had to do instead was go to plan B and give it to his two younger sons and somebody who was an illegitimate grandchild. But these were inept and almost incompetent to do the task. And after Charlemagne died, the nations of Europe, as they were at that time, fell right back into the warring and bickering that they had been doing all the time previous. And it tore itself apart once again. But now we have somebody else who comes along the scene as well. We have Charles V. The year is 1519. And he was elected the Holy Roman Emperor. The people were desperate for unity in all of this. The Protestant Reformation is in full swing and underway in Germany, was sharply divided as a result of it. In spite of that, Charles V expanded his empire to almost 4 million kilometers, or 1.5 million miles. Now that's a lot of territory. It was looking really good, but then all of a sudden, his health took a turn for the worse. He got horrible gout, and as a result was not able to lead his troops into battle, and then he got malaria and died. So ultimately his efforts failed as well. Then of course we have somebody that we already mentioned earlier tonight, Napoleon. Napoleon tried to do this through military conquest. He was arrogant and proud. And at one moment, the Pope was actually about to crown him to be the Emperor of Europe, but what he ended up doing, at least the story is told, is that he grabbed the wreath out of the Pope's hand and crowned himself to be the Emperor. Very proud and very arrogant. So let that be something that can sink into those who are proud and arrogant themselves, that their pride and the arrogance will ultimately not lead to success and victory. Napoleon had apparent success. It almost looked like he would succeed in ruling all of Europe, but ultimately he too failed, as we mentioned earlier. Then we have somebody by the name of Kaiser Wilhelm. This is in the 20th century now, and we're getting into World War I. And at one point, Kaiser was winning. England was losing. So the British, out of desperation, asked for the Americans for help. But President Wilson at the time really wasn't interested. And he even said, that's just not our war. He really didn't want to get involved at first. But Germany got wind that Britain was asking America for help, and Britain got a little scared. They got a little panicky. They didn't really want the Americans to get involved in this conflict because they knew if they did, it would make it very, very difficult for Germany to have ultimate success. So they hatched a plan. What is it that they did? What the Germans did is they sent a message to Mexico asking for an alliance. And their plan was to say, you, Mexico, attack America and take back all the land that used to be yours. You can take New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. Keep them busy. We'll give you all the support you need. As long as you guys are keeping the Americans busy over there at their southern border, they won't be looking our way. Well, what ended up happening? The British got wind of this. In fact, this is a picture of that telegram. It's called the Zimmermann telegram. They were able to capture the telegram and decipher it. Look at this, they said. Germany is planning to invade the United States. Well, that was really all that they needed to hear. The president got so mad that he joined the war, and Germany was ultimately defeated. So how is it then that all of this is coming about? How did England manage to get that telegram? Why did Germany really lose that war? Were these all just happenstance things? When we look at things where the Duke of Wellington and Napoleon Bonaparte, two individuals who are so evenly matched with one another, but yet one defeats the other rather than drawing a stalemate, how is it that these things end up coming into place at just the times when they do? Because God's word said that these nations would not be welded back together again. But the story does not end here. There's another individual who comes along the way, an individual by the name of Adolf Hitler, who was actually a young soldier in Kaiser Wilhelm's army. He was embarrassed by this defeat, and he even said, I will finish what Napoleon started. He even said, I will build an empire, a Reich, that will last for 1,000 years. No empire on earth has ever lasted that long. But that's what Hitler wanted to do. And you know something? I believe, incidentally, that he knew he was defying the will of God in saying such a thing. There are actually stories about people who showed Daniel chapter 2 to Hitler. Now, it's impossible to prove that that is correct. I know that there are those who were in Hitler's army who did show this prophecy from Daniel chapter 2 to their commanding officers, and their commanding officers took these things to heart, and it ended up saving lives in the long run. As for whether or not we actually can prove that people showed this prophecy to Hitler, it's more difficult to do. However, Hitler himself says something about this that I think we may be able to glean that he did have an understanding of Bible prophecy. Look at these words from March of 1941 from Adolf Hitler. See, my people, we do not need anything from God. We do not ask him for anything except that he may let us alone. We want to fight our own war with our own guns, without God. We want to gain our victory without the help of God. Words like this would seem to indicate that Hitler knew that this Bible prophecy existed, that nobody would ever be able to weld the European nations back together again. I'm telling you, he knew that he couldn't do it with the help of God, and neither can anybody else. And a few years later, of course, after this, he died in a bunker, and his attempt to bring this 1,000-year Reich also failed. It's not because he wasn't smart enough. It's because God said that these nations shall not adhere one to another. Of course, now after World War II, another attempt was made, and that is communism. The Soviet Union tried it. They knew that for communism to ultimately work, they would eventually have to conquer the entire world. And a huge portion of Eastern Europe fell under their control, including East Germany. In fact, this is something that I'm young enough to remember, so I know that there are many other people who can remember this, when Ronald Reagan said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." I actually know people, and maybe some of you do too, who were there when that happened. Maybe you were somebody who was there when that happened. But what does that tell us? This wall was erected, but it eventually was also torn down. And the attempt from communism failed at bringing these nations of Europe back together under a single umbrella. At one point, they actually controlled, this is the communist Russia, that is, 1/3 of the Earth's geography. But then in 1989, it all fell apart. Now, the current attempt is the European Union. Some people point to the European Union as evidence that the Western Roman Empire can reunite. But that experiment is falling apart in front of our eyes. For years, there have been countries that have been a part of the EU that have struggled immensely to be on board. Some nations are hard-pressed to be on it. Some nations cannot be admitted into the European Union. Some are strong economically, and others are a complete sieve of economic funds, and they are a constant financial drain on the European Union, and also bringing about the possible instability of the global market. All of this is happening right in front of us. And why is that? But because God himself said that these nations shall not cleave one to another. It's been tried through marriage, it's been tried through war, it's being tried now through economics, and every one of these attempts have had apparent success, but ultimately every one of these attempts will also fail, as everyone else has in the past. What is it then that Daniel has to say about this? His explanation of this vision is not yet done. Daniel 2, verse 44, "And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever." This is a kingdom that is not corruptible. This is a kingdom that will not be replaced, and it will not pass away. It's because it's God's kingdom. It's the one that will last forever. And we can expect that when we see Jesus, that Jesus is going to tell us this is what is also true now. In fact, he said something about this in the Gospel of Matthew. We have here Matthew 25, verse 31. "When the Son of God comes in his glory and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory." Now think about this carefully. Everything in Daniel 2, except this very last thing that we just said, has happened already. We've already had the head of gold, the chest and arms of silver, the belly of bronze, the legs of iron, the feet of iron and clay. We live today in the very toenails, the very edge of that statue right now. The only thing left to happen is that stone that has been cut out without hands to strike that image on the feet and blow the whole thing into millions of pieces, like chaff on the summer threshing floor, for the wind to just carry them away. And that mountain will be set up like one that will never fall apart. This is the only thing that is left to have happen. Everything else in this vision has happened as it was said. There are those who have tried to make this vision seem like it was all written after the fact. But friends, the more evidence that we find, the more that the evidence tells us that no, this was written 600 years before Christ was born. We can trust the Bible. We can trust what the scriptures have for us, and we can trust how this roadmap has pointed out what is yet to come as well. God did not give us these things to be fearful, but rather as waymarks for encouragement, because Jesus is coming back again, and he wants us to be ready. Take a look at your life now, and you know there's got to be something better. If right now you're thinking that this is the best there is, then you're missing out on something tremendous. I don't know if you've ever been traveling and gotten sick, but it can be very awful. be stuck somewhere in a motel alone by yourself, running a fever. You take an aspirin, but it doesn't help. You curl up in the blankets, but the blankets aren't yours. The bed isn't yours. You try to keep warm, but it's really no use. You're uncomfortable. And you sit there shivering, sweating, aching all over, and you know that there's somewhere else that you would rather be. Somewhere where maybe you have a husband or a wife or a loved one who could help comfort you and get you through this. There is somewhere else that you want to be during that time of illness. My friends, right now we are the ones who are ill. We are the ones who are looking for another home, someplace else that we can look to and call home, where we can say, this is where I want to be. Don't let yourself get caught up in the here and the now, thinking that this is all that there is, because this world is going to pass away. Everything that we know and understand now will become ashes, and the only thing that's going to matter is the character of love that you develop in your heart now, the character of God. That is what matters. We can trust the scriptures, my friend. Jesus is coming soon. All the signs that we're looking at now are pointing to it. Are you ready when that happens? Thank you for joining us for In the Scriptures today. It has been our pleasure to have been a part of your day today. If there is anything that you would like to contact us about, or a question that you have regarding anything that is covered in the Scriptures, then I invite you to connect with us by sending us an email to contact@inthescriptures.com. That's contact@inthescriptures.com. We also have a free offer this month that comes to us from the ministry It Is Written, and is titled, Why Does God Allow Suffering? If you would like your free copy of this study guide, then you can again use that same email address of contact@inthescriptures.com and let us know how to get your free copy of Why Does God Allow Suffering into your hands. Additionally, if you would like to receive a DVD copy of this program, then again you can use that same email address of contact@inthescriptures.com and let us know where to send your DVD to. We look forward to hearing from you and engaging in an uplifting dialogue where we explore the Scriptures together, and most importantly, where Christ is glorified. Once again, that email address is contact@inthescriptures.com. Thank you again for watching. Have a wonderful and Christ-centered day.
Tucson, Arizona hosts the 309th Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Group, where over 4,000 aircraft from all branches of the U.S. government are stored for various reasons and lengths of time. While some aircraft are salvaged for parts, others are kept with the intent to be used again. These aircraft go through a detailed process for their storage and then require another lengthy process to bring them back into operational condition. All this takes time, but the Bible tells us of someone that is ever at the ready. The book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus ever lives to make intercession for us. This means that he is constantly in a state of readiness to stand on our behalf and defend us as one of his own. Take the time today to make Jesus your great defender by making him your Savior. I'm Craig Fish, and let's remember to live every day according to what is in the Scriptures.